My mother-in-law stood in our kitchen flawless in pearls and judgment. She didn't yell. She didn't have to. "You don't belong here, Camille. You're too poor, too plain. If my son stays with you, he's no longer part of this family." Easton just kept folding his shirts like none of it hurt him. That moment didn't just crack something in me, it shattered it. But I didn't cry. I didn't scream. I left with nothing. And 1 year later, I didn't need revenge. Because what I had in my hands made them look away one by one before a single word was spoken. The sound of my suitcase zipper felt louder than it should have in the silence of the Lynch townhouse. Rain tapped softly against the tall windows of the Charleston skyline as I stood frozen in the living room, heart racing but feet refusing to move. My fingers trembled around the strap of my tote bag, still half-packed, half hoping I wouldn't need it. But the truth hung thick in the air, impossible to ignore. Eleanor's heels clicked across the polished hardwood as she entered the room, every step deliberate, rehearsed. Her pearl earrings didn't sway. Her spine didn't bend. She looked like she had just walked off the pages of a magazine for wealthy Southern matriarchs, all pristine white silk and cold command. She didn't look at me when she spoke. "You don't belong here. You're too poor." I felt something rupture inside my chest quietly. No scream. No dramatic gasp. Just a sinking in my stomach, a hollowing of whatever illusion I had left that I was accepted. That this home could ever truly be mine. Behind her, Brent stood near the stairs, arms folded, eyes downcast. My husband. The man who once told me none of this mattered, that love could bridge any divide. He was wearing the same navy sweater I had bought for his birthday last year, the sleeves now rolled nervously to his elbows. He didn't speak. Eleanor opened a sleek leather folder and pulled out a document, sliding it onto the entryway table with a credit card clipped to the top. Her voice didn't rise. She didn't need to raise it to stab. "The lease is under our name. You'll find a courtesy check included. She can pack up and go." I stared at the document. At the neat signature that confirmed it. That I was a guest in my own marriage. An outsider granted temporary access until the family decided otherwise. "Brent," I said, my voice barely above a whisper. "Say something." He swallowed hard. I tried to explain to them, Cam. I told them you weren't what I cut in. That I wasn't rich enough, not raised with silver spoons and debutante balls. It's complicated." "No, it's not." I shook my head, feeling tears push behind my eyes, but refusing to fall. "It's actually painfully simple." Eleanor finally met my gaze, and for a second, I saw a flicker of satisfaction beneath the indifference. As if she had always known this day would come, and she had waited patiently for the moment I would fold. I looked at Brent again. The man who once promised to fight for me. Now he couldn't even meet my eyes. I reached for my ring finger, twisted the band slowly, then slid it off. The metal was warm against my skin, familiar. I placed it on the marble entry table beside the check and the card. "There. That's the last thing I owe you." "Camille," Brent said, stepping forward. "Don't." I stepped back. "If you wanted to choose me, you would have. But you didn't." I opened the closet by the front door and pulled out my coat. My suitcase was already by the door. I had packed it that morning without admitting to myself what it meant. Now I knew. Eleanor smoothed her blouse and turned away, already finished with the conversation. Brent stood frozen in place, mouth parted as if he might say something else but couldn't find the words. I took one last look at the home I had tried so hard to make mine. The kitchen where I baked him birthday cookies. The sofa we chose together. The framed photograph from our wedding still hanging by the stairwell. None of it was mine. Outside, the rain had turned heavier. I pulled my coat tight around me and stepped into it without an umbrella, dragging the suitcase behind me down the front steps. The Lynch home loomed behind me like a monument to everything I wasn't allowed to be. I didn't look back. By the time I reached the corner, my shoes were soaked and my fingers numb. I pulled out my phone and dialed the only number that felt like safety. Nina answered on the second ring. "Camille, I'm out," I said. My voice cracked on the second word. Silence. Then, "Stay right there. I'm coming." Number, I exhaled. "I'll come to you." "Are you sure I can't be alone tonight?" 15 minutes later, I was sitting in Nina's living room wrapped in a dry blanket, a cup of peppermint tea in my hands. Her apartment smelled like lavender and dryer sheets. Safe things, real things. She sat beside me on the couch, arms crossed, eyes burning. I'll kill them. I let out a breathless laugh. Don't. They're not worth prison time. What happened? I told her everything. The sentence. The silence. The card. The check. She shook her head slowly, then leaned forward, elbows on her knees. You know this isn't about you, right? It's about them. Their need to control everything. To define value by wealth and names on buildings. You are not the problem. I know, I said quietly. But it doesn't make it hurt less. She reached over and squeezed my hand. Then we make sure this isn't where it ends. I looked at her, really looked. At the fire in her eyes. The certainty. And for the first time that night, I felt something that didn't burn. A beginning. The next morning, sunlight slipped in through the blinds and painted soft stripes across the living room floor. I sat at Nina's kitchen table wrapped in one of her oversized sweatshirts, staring blankly at a bowl of oatmeal I hadn't touched. My suitcase was still by the door, unopened since last night, like some quiet reminder that I didn't really belong anywhere. Nina placed a mug of coffee beside me, then sat across with a notepad in hand. We need a plan, she said, not asking, just stating it as fact. I gave a tired shrug. A plan for what? Divorce. Finding a job at 33 with nothing but a degree I never used and a resume full of rich people's party planning and unpaid family favors. She flipped a page. Number a plan for your comeback. I blinked at her. My what, Camille, she said, eyes narrowing. Don't act like you haven't already done harder things than this. You put yourself through college waiting tables while Eleanor was off playing tennis in white linen. You built your marriage basically from scratch while juggling two families. And you've been pretending to be someone else for so long you forgot how good you are at being you. I pressed my palms to my temples. I appreciate the pep talk, but I need more than motivation right now. I need a miracle. Nina stood and disappeared down the hall. A moment later, she returned holding a soft brown journal with a rubber band wrapped around it twice. She set it down in front of me like it was sacred. Remember this? I stared at it. My recipe journal. My real one, not the fancy Pinterest version I once made for Eleanor's approval. This one had stains and wrinkled corners and notes written in blue ink at 2 a.m. I hadn't seen it in years. Where did you find this? In your old storage bin from college. I never threw anything away. She smirked. I figured you'd come back to it eventually. I ran my fingers over the cover. Inside were pages and pages of formulas I had crafted in my tiny dorm kitchen using oatmeal, rosehip oil, lavender, shea butter. Back then, I just wanted to soothe my own skin. Later, it became something I loved doing for friends. I had even made Eleanor a custom moisturizer for her birthday once. She never knew it came from my hands. I flipped to a page marked night serum, dry skin base, and for a second I remembered what it felt like to be in control of something. Anything. I'm not saying you need to launch a brand tomorrow, Nina said, reading my silence. But this is yours. This is something they never touched, never stained. I closed the journal and held it to my chest. What would that even look like? I asked softly. Starting from nothing, Nina grinned. Like a white sheet and a loud idea. What? When I left Tony, remember, I slept on a mattress on the floor under a white sheet for 3 months. I had no plan, no job, no clue what came next. But I wrote one line in my notebook: every day I will rebuild piece by piece. And now you're sitting in my guest robe drinking organic coffee in a townhouse I bought from selling 3 novels. So, yeah. Start with a white sheet. Start with one line. One jar, one formula. Later that afternoon, I walked downtown for fresh air. The streets were still wet from the morning drizzle, but the sky had cleared. I wandered into a coffee shop I hadn't visited in years, the kind with creaky floorboards and chalkboard menus. I ordered a small black coffee and sat near the window pulling out my journal. I was jotting down ingredient ratios when someone at the next table cleared his throat. Excuse me, are you working on something for skincare? I turned. The man was in his 40s, neat but not flashy, with glasses and a soft gray sweater. Sort of, I said cautiously. Sorry to interrupt. I just couldn't help noticing your notes. My name's Graham Ellis. I do consulting and early-stage investing for small brands, especially in wellness and beauty. He paused. Just habit to listen when someone says rosehip suspension out loud. I smiled despite myself. I'm Camille Turner. He extended a hand and I shook it. Do you have a brand? No, just a few pages of old ideas. Sometimes that's the best place to begin. He sipped his coffee. Have you ever thought about turning it into something more? I stared at him. Not until recently. Well, he said, reaching into his bag and pulling out a slim business card. If you're serious and you're willing to put in real work, I'd be happy to give you some pointers. No pressure, just think about it. I took the card. It was simple, clean, embossed with his name and email. Thank you. That's generous. Someone took a chance on me once, he said. I just try to return the favor when I see potential. He stood, nodded politely, and left. I watched him walk out the door, the bell chiming gently behind him. I stared at the card in my hand, then back at my journal. Maybe Nina was right. Maybe the pieces were already here. All I had to do was pick them up. I didn't have a business plan. I didn't even have a real logo, just the rough sketch I doodled on the back of a grocery receipt while waiting for my coffee. But what I did have was a name, and it came to me like a whisper through fog: Freeman Naturals. Freeman was my mother's maiden name. She'd given it up when she married my father, but I remembered the way she used to sign her letters to me when I was away at camp. Love, Mama Freeman. That name meant something. It carried dignity, strength, and something I hadn't had in years: freedom. I called Graham that afternoon and told him the name. There was a pause, then he said in that calm, steady voice of his, I like it. But listen to me. Before you do anything else, file the paperwork, trademark it, register the business. Don't let anyone step on your dream again. His words hit deeper than I expected. I knew exactly what it felt like to have your vision hijacked. I wasn't letting that happen again. The next day, we met at a local co-working space downtown. It smelled like burnt espresso and fresh ambition. Graham wore a simple navy blazer and jeans, a laptop under one arm and a to-go mug in the other. I brought my notebook, Nina's old recipe binder, and a nervous energy I couldn't shake. He walked me through everything. EIN number, LLC registration, domain name, trademark search. I felt like I was drinking from a fire hose. But he never made me feel small. When I hesitated over the filing fee, he said, "You've already paid more than this in pain. Let's make sure it wasn't for nothing." I reached for my wallet, but he stopped me. "This one's on me. Call it an investment in someone who deserves a second chance." I wanted to cry, but instead I swallowed hard and said thank you. Within a week, Freeman Naturals existed on paper. And then in a tiny sublet room that smelled of lavender oil and possibility, it began to exist in the real world too. I rented a shared kitchen space in a converted warehouse on the east side of town. The walls were exposed brick, the lighting was bad, and the heat didn't always work. But it was mine. Or at least it felt that way. I painted one wall sage green and pinned up old magazine cutouts, mood boards, and quotes I'd scribbled on sticky notes during sleepless nights. Make something honest. Beauty should heal. No one's skin is disposable. And then there was Maya. She showed up after seeing my Craigslist ad. 24, fresh out of community college, she had a piercing in her nose and wore a t-shirt that said "Plants over Profits." She smiled wide, asked smart questions, and didn't flinch when I told her I couldn't afford to pay much at first. "It's okay," she said, tucking a strand of curly hair behind her ear. "I just want to be part of something that matters. Plus, I can live on ramen and caffeine for a while." I laughed, and just like that, she became my first employee. We worked side by side, measuring out oils, melting shea butter, mixing scrubs in small stainless steel bowls. We argued about labels, font choices, and whether the scent called Citrus Meadow was too cliché. She brought a Bluetooth speaker, and we played a mix of indie rock and 90-second pop while we packed orders. At night, I went home with my arms covered in essential oil and my mind racing with ideas. Sometimes I'd catch myself smiling at nothing. I hadn't done that in years. One evening, Graham stopped by the space unannounced. He stood in the doorway watching as Maya and I debated which tape dispenser wasted less product. "I see a real business here," he said after I walked him to the loading dock. "A real story. People are going to want to know who's behind it." I shrugged. "I'm not sure they'd care." He tilted his head. "Then make them care. Tell the story before someone else does." He was right. So I started writing little notes for our website. I shared how my mother used calendula for rashes and how I learned to make rosewater from her old mason jars. I wrote about how beauty had always been my language, but somewhere along the way, someone stole my voice. Now I was reclaiming it. Maya suggested we film short videos for Instagram. She edited them on her laptop, adding captions and lo-fi music. In one of them, I stood in front of the sage wall and said, "This isn't about perfection. This is about healing what we were taught to hate." The video didn't go viral, but it got shared, then saved. Then messages started trickling in from women who said they saw themselves in what we were doing. We weren't just making face cream, we were building something sacred. Of course, it wasn't all smooth. The first batch of moisturizer curdled after we stored it wrong. The shipping costs ate into our tiny margins. My car broke down twice on supply runs and I had to borrow Nina's truck. But every problem felt solvable because for the first time in a long time I wasn't solving it alone. Late one night, I sat in the back of the workspace surrounded by jars and invoices. The air was thick with the scent of bergamot and exhaustion. Graham called just to check in. I told him we'd gotten our first wholesale inquiry. He chuckled. "And to think 2 months ago you didn't even believe in yourself." "I do now," I said softly. "Good, then act like it." His voice stayed with me long after we hung up. So I pulled out my notebook, turned to a blank page, and wrote 3 words at the top. Scale with integrity. I stared at it for a while, then closed the book and leaned back in my chair. The scent of freedom wasn't just in our products. It was in the air, in the cracks of the old tile floor, in the way Maya hummed when she worked. And for the first time, I wasn't afraid of what came next. The morning of the expo, I woke up 2 hours before my alarm with a tight flutter in my chest. Not fear, not quite. More like something electric buzzing. I rolled over and stared at the boxes piled by the front door. Labels handwritten. Jars cushioned in recycled craft paper. Maya had double-checked everything the night before, but I checked again. Then again. By the time we arrived at the downtown convention center, the loading dock was chaos. Vendors shouted over forklifts and the air reeked of hairspray, foam board, and nerves. Our booth number was 217. Tucked in the back row near the emergency exit and a pretzel cart. Not glamorous, but it was ours. We laid out the tablecloth, taped up our banner that still had a small wrinkle I couldn't smooth out, and arranged the tiny glass jars in a pyramid. Each label said Freeman Naturals in soft sage green. Underneath, botanical skincare handcrafted with integrity. The slogan still made me blush a little. By 10 a.m., the doors opened and a rush of heels, lanyards, and floral perfume swept past us toward the big-name booths near the front. Luxe Skincare had a full-wall LED screen looping their promo reel. Afro Beauty had brought a flower wall and hired models. One booth had a live demo with a dermatologist in a lab coat talking into a headset like he was hosting a game show. Compared to them, we looked homemade. Which we were. But we didn't try to hide it. Our testers were lined up neatly, each with a tiny wooden spoon and a note that read, "Take a bit, breathe it in, ask us anything." Maya had suggested it. People smiled when they saw it. A few curious faces stopped by. A woman with a baby strapped to her chest sniffed our calendula balm and lit up. Another took a sample of the rosehip face oil and asked if we sold online. Maya handled them like a pro, walking them through ingredients, routines, shelf life. I mostly watched, stunned that anyone even cared. Around noon, I stepped out to grab us smoothies. When I came back, Maya's face had gone stiff and the booth was quiet. Then I saw her. Veronica Hale. She hadn't changed much since college. Maybe her hair was lighter and her nails longer, but the same smirk played on her lips as she circled our table like a lion sizing up a wounded deer. She was wearing a pale blue sheath dress with crystal straps heels that probably cost more than our monthly rent and a lanyard that read Creative Director, Luxe Skincare. She picked up one of our jars and turned it over like she expected it to break. Then she looked up, her eyes landing on me. Camille Freeman, she said, drawing out the syllables like a bad memory. Still mixing things in your kitchen, I smiled. Still buying awards. She laughed, high-pitched and sharp. Her gaze dropped to the price tags. These are cute. Are you actually selling anything, or is this just craft therapy? Before I could reply, she pulled out her phone and took a photo of our display. Then another of the ingredient sheet we had printed for transparency. She didn't ask. Just snapped and walked off. Maya exhaled loudly. Did she just steal our formula? No, I said quietly. She just stole our fear. The rest of the day blurred. We had no giant screens, no influencer meet and greet, but people still came. They touched the textures, they asked about ingredients, they smiled. One woman said our lavender cream reminded her of her grandmother's garden in Vermont. That alone made everything worth it. But the moment I didn't expect came around 3 p.m. A tall woman in a black jumpsuit and red lipstick wandered over, sunglasses still on. She looked expensive but tired. She rubbed a sample of our lemon balm on the back of her hand, lifted it to her nose, and paused. Who made this? I stepped forward. I did. She took off her glasses, revealing sharp gray eyes that studied me like I was a paragraph she hadn't decided whether to underline. Marissa Carter, beauty editor at Elon Weekly. My throat went dry. I knew the name. Everyone in the industry did. Her column could make or break a brand overnight. She tapped the jar again. It's good, surprisingly so. Your local Seattle, I said. Small batch, organic sourcing. No synthetic fragrances. She nodded slowly, then glanced over her shoulder. This space could use better lighting. And a rug. But the product, it has soul. Don't lose that. She tucked a card into my hand. Email me by Tuesday. Then she turned and vanished into the crowd. I looked down at the card like it was made of gold. Maya grabbed my wrist. That was Marissa freaking Carter. I know. We both burst out laughing. Not because it was funny, but because the air suddenly felt a little lighter. That night, back at the apartment, my feet throbbed and my back ached, but my heart felt strangely full. I poured us 2 glasses of cheap white wine and sat cross-legged on the floor with Maya boxes around us like a castle of cardboard. You think we sold enough to break even? She asked. Maybe. Maybe not. But we started something, and I had the business card to prove it. Outside the window, Seattle's sky was dark and drizzling again, but this time it didn't feel like gloom. It felt like something was growing. Quietly, persistently, from the inside out. The email came in just after sunrise, when the city was still holding its breath in that early morning hush. I was standing in the kitchen barefoot on the cold tile waiting for the kettle to boil when my phone buzzed. It was from Marissa Carter. Subject line, loved meeting you. Let's talk. I clicked it open and read it once, twice, then a third time just to be sure I wasn't still dreaming. Camille. That was one of the most refreshing conversations I've had in years. I love what you're doing with Freeman Naturals. Would you be open to a feature in our upcoming fall issue? I'd like to do a spotlight on founders who are redefining clean beauty. Warmly, Marissa, I pressed my fingertips to my lips, trying to contain the grin that spread across my face. A feature. In one of the most respected beauty publications in the country. This wasn't just press. This was credibility. Visibility. A door swinging wide open. Graham shuffled into the kitchen, rubbing his eyes. When he saw my face, he paused. Good news, he asked, reaching for a mug. I held out the phone. He read the email and let out a low whistle. That's big, Cam. Huge. This could change everything. I nodded, heart still fluttering. But even as I poured our tea, something tugged at the back of my mind. A feeling I'd learned not to ignore. Like static before a storm. By noon, the first drop hit. A sponsored post popped up in my feed from Luxe Skincare. It was slick and vague like most of their marketing, but the wording made my stomach twist. Coming soon. A revolutionary leap in clean beauty. Organic, sustainable, luxuriously simple. Veronica's smirking face flashed in my memory. Her phone angled just so. The way she lingered near our shelf. I showed the post to Graham without a word. He leaned in frowning. That sounds a lot like us. More than a lot, I murmured, already pulling up the ingredient list we'd submitted for our trademark application 3 months ago. I cross-referenced it with a snippet I found in an early product registration Luxay had filed through a third-party vendor. The overlap was terrifying. Calendula oil, chamomile extract, white willow bark, green tea concentrate, probiotic ferment, all in the same ratios, the same phrasing. My throat went dry. It's not just similar, it's a match. Graham's jaw tightened. They're trying to beat us to launch. Package our formula with their brand and pretend it was theirs all along. I slammed my laptop shut and stood up. Number. He looked at me. We're not going to panic, we're going to prepare. Within the hour, we were on the phone with David Nolan, our attorney and longtime friend. He was calm, measured, and furious on our behalf. I'll need a full documentation chain, David said. Every email, every timestamp, your trademark filing notes from the lab. And if you have a photo or proof that Veronica Hale was at your booth, even better. I sent him everything. Receipts, screenshots. The sample jar Veronica had handled was still with us, her fingerprint would be on it. By late afternoon, David called back. His voice was steady but hard. They've filed for expedited approval on a product that is, by all accounts, your exact formula. I've already sent a cease and desist and a notice of intent to file a copyright and IP infringement claim. If they proceed with marketing or distribution, we will take this to federal court. I closed my eyes for a second, letting it settle. This wasn't just about my work anymore. This was about ownership. About the years I spent mixing oils in my apartment, sourcing herbs from ethical farms, testing batches on my own skin. Veronica thought she could take all of that and stamp her name on it. She didn't know I kept records. She didn't know I had filed months ago. She didn't know the quiet girl she used to mock at school had learned to wield silence like armor. When I opened my eyes, Graham was watching me. You okay? I nodded slowly. Yes. But I want to be ready. Because if they leak it to the press, it's not just a legal fight, it's perception. And we need to control the narrative. He smiled faintly. That interview with Marissa, it just became our first move. We stayed up late outlining everything we wanted to say. About the origin of Freeman Naturals. About why we chose each ingredient. About the philosophy behind it. We weren't just selling a serum. We were selling trust, transparency, values. And in the world of beauty where everything could be airbrushed and bought that mattered. The next morning, Marissa replied with a time and place for the interview. She wanted to meet in person. Somewhere quiet, neutral. She suggested a bookstore cafe in Capitol Hill. I typed back a single word. Perfect. Because the moment you try to silence someone who built their truth from the ground up, all you do is give them a bigger platform. And I wasn't afraid to use it. 1 year later, Seattle didn't feel quite so gray. Even with clouds sweeping across the late October sky, the city had found a new hue in my eyes. Maybe it was the way Freeman Naturals had taken root in a way I never expected. Maybe it was me too. Stronger. A little less afraid of rooms filled with people who used to look right through me. The invitation had come 3 months earlier. A sleek envelope on heavy cream cardstock embossed with silver foil, the Lynch Foundation, gala honoring innovation in sustainable beauty. Graham read it first, his eyebrows lifting with quiet amusement. The Lynch Foundation was co-founded by Eleanor Lynch. That alone would have been enough to make my stomach tighten. But the list of featured brands included Freeman Naturals. And the schedule had me speaking on a panel about clean formulations and ethical supply chains. Graham set the envelope down gently. He didn't say a word, just waited for me to breathe. I did. Then I smiled. I was ready. The gala was held at the Fairmont in downtown Seattle. The whole building glowed from the inside out, warm lights streaming through towering glass windows as guests arrived in tuxedos and silk gowns. I wore a deep emerald green dress, sleek and simple, with my hair pulled back to show the silver earrings my grandmother once gave me. We were greeted by a woman with a clipboard and a polished smile who handed us our badges and escorted us toward the VIP cocktail hour. I caught glimpses of faces I hadn't seen in years. Some blinked twice when they registered who I was. Others gave tight nods and turned away. I had grown familiar with those reactions. It was the price of stepping back into rooms I had once been locked out of. Halfway through the reception, Graham leaned closer. His breath tickled my temple. "They didn't expect to see you here," he murmured. I followed his gaze. Across the room near the bar stood Eleanor in a navy sheath dress, one hand curled around a crystal flute of champagne. Richard stood beside her, still carrying the weight of smug confidence like a tailored coat. And Brent, in a charcoal suit, tapping something into his phone. He must have seen my name on the roster. Or maybe Veronica had told him. Either way, my phone buzzed hours earlier. "Can we talk tonight? Just for a minute." I had stared at the message for 5 seconds. Then pressed delete. Now from across the marble floor Brent looked up. Our eyes locked. His face flickered with something like guilt or longing or shame. But I didn't look away. I just turned slightly enough for the light to catch the logo on my badge. Freeman Naturals. Then I turned my back to him. The ballroom was filled with gold light and soft strings as we were ushered to our table. I sat between Graham and Marissa, who had flown in from San Francisco that morning. Across the table sat a chemist from a partnering lab and a journalist from Greenscope magazine who had interviewed me last spring. My name was listed third in the speaker program, just after the CEO of a sustainable packaging startup and just before a fireside chat with Veronica Dawson. Veronica was here to promote her company's newest product. The same one we had intercepted a year ago with a quiet but firm cease and desist letter. The one with a formula so close to ours, it had taken 2 full pages of evidence from David Nolan to convince their legal team to quietly settle. They had tweaked a few ingredients, changed the name, delayed the launch by 9 months. But I recognized the bottle design immediately when it appeared in Veronica's Instagram story a week ago. She called it a reimagining of luxury and nature. I called it a cheap disguise. When the lights dimmed and the MC took the stage, I felt a ripple of tension settle into my spine. My palms were steady, my breath calm, but my eyes were scanning the crowd. I spotted Eleanor again near the front. She was seated at a reserved table with Richard and a few people I didn't recognize. Her posture was perfect, her earrings glittering as she turned to whisper something to the woman beside her. Then, as the MC introduced Freeman Naturals and my name rang out over the speakers, Eleanor turned. Her eyes met mine, and she looked away. It wasn't hurried, it wasn't theatrical, it was almost casual. But there was a tightness in her jaw that gave it away. Like swallowing something bitter. Graham reached under the table and squeezed my hand. I rose slowly. As I walked to the stage, I felt the heat of 100 gazes. Some curious, some surprised, some stunned. But none of them mattered as much as the one that had just turned away. I took the microphone. And I smiled. The lights dimmed just enough to hush the crowd. A glittering hush settled over the ballroom like a dusting of frost. All eyes turned toward the stage where a towering banner read, "A greener tomorrow courtesy of the Lynch Foundation and Luxe Beauty." Veronica appeared from the wings with perfect posture and a practiced smile. She wore emerald green, a calculated choice, I was sure. The crowd applauded politely. She let it linger for a second longer than necessary, basking. Then she stepped forward and began, her voice amplified but warm. Luxe is proud to introduce its newest breakthrough line in clean beauty. She gestured grandly and a slide appeared behind her with the words "Pure Origins" by Luxe. The audience clapped louder this time. Some even rose for a standing ovation. In the corner of the room, I could see Richard beaming, Eleanor nodding in silent approval, and Brent watching with tight-lipped pride. I remained seated. Veronica continued with confidence. She talked about sustainably sourced ingredients, proprietary formulations, a patented infusion method. Each buzzword struck a nerve. Every phrase was once mine. I knew it because I had written them first a year ago in the original white paper for Freeman Naturals. She was stealing the language of my company, wearing it like a borrowed dress, and then she said it. This line is the future of ethical beauty. Entirely organic, cruelty-free, and protected under patent 789-992. I didn't even have time to react before the sound system clicked sharply. From the side of the room, David Nolan stepped forward in a sharp navy suit. He didn't climb the stage. He simply walked to the foot of it, lifted a microphone, and cleared his throat. "I am David Nolan, attorney representing Freeman Naturals," he said with measured calm. "I'm here under instruction from the board and IP council." Murmurs rippled like water through the guests. Veronica blinked down at him, her smile faltering. "Effective immediately, we are issuing a cease and desist notice to Luxe Beauty and all affiliates in accordance with U.S. patent law. Patent 789-992 does not belong to Luxe. It was registered by Freeman Naturals on July 12th of last year." The room fell completely still. Veronica stepped back. "What is this?" "This is a misunderstanding." David didn't flinch. His tone was like stone. "We have filed a federal injunction. You are no longer permitted to distribute, advertise, or pitch this product in any format. That includes this event." Suddenly, the massive screen behind her flickered. The Luxe logo vanished. In its place, a government-stamped document appeared. Patent 789-992. Underneath it, the name Freeman Naturals, Inc. Gasps filled the ballroom. It got worse. The screen changed again, now displaying two product slides side by side. One was Pure Origins by Luxe. The other, the original formula and packaging concept for Freeman's Essence Root line. The formulas were almost identical. Then came an internal email chain. Screenshots. Metadata. Dated a full 3 months before Veronica had announced her so-called new line. One of the emails included my original draft. There it was. My work, my language, my structure. Loud whispers erupted. Reporters began typing frantically. A woman at the back dropped her champagne flute. Eleanor stood frozen, her expression unreadable. Richard's face had gone pale. Brent leaned toward Veronica, whispering something urgently. She stepped back from the microphone, then forward again, flustered. This is a smear campaign. It's personal." She pointed in my direction. "Camille used to work for me. This is revenge." David held up a hand. "It's not revenge, it's the law." Two security guards from the Lynch Foundation quietly approached the stage. One gestured gently toward Veronica. "We're going to need you to step down now." She refused to move. "My father is on the board. You have no idea who you're dealing with." The screen flicked again. This time it displayed a formal letter from the Lynch Foundation's Ethics Committee. It confirmed their disassociation with Luxe, effective immediately pending legal review. That did it. Veronica stood stiffly, her shoulders squared but trembling. One of the guards stepped closer and whispered something. Finally, she turned and walked off the stage, eyes burning but dry. People didn't know whether to clap or stay silent. The tension was suffocating. I stayed seated, expression neutral. But inside me, a quiet storm finally settled. Brent glanced at me as she passed, but I looked away. I had no interest in catching the eye of a man who once told me I was lucky to be in the room. A woman near the front row whispered loudly enough for me to hear. I thought that was her formula. She told me at the spring luncheon, but no one believed her. It didn't matter anymore. They knew now. The moderator came on stage awkwardly and thanked the crowd. The schedule had been disrupted, but the rest of the evening would continue with adjusted programming. The music returned softly, but the air was different now. Hushed. Cautious. Graham walked up to me and leaned down. That was masterful. I glanced sideways at him. It wasn't about revenge. He smiled. Number. It was about the truth finally having its turn. I looked across the room where Eleanor was staring straight ahead, hands folded in her lap, her expression stone cold. Funny, I thought. They used to say I was too soft to survive in business. Now none of them could look me in the eye. They all kept glancing over their shoulders like I might still be watching, like I might still have another card to play. I didn't. I had played it. And the silence in that ballroom was louder than anything I could have shouted. I moved toward the exit, the weight of the spotlight finally off my shoulders. I could feel the sting of their eyes, not bold enough to confront me but sharp enough to pierce if I let them. I didn't. I had almost made it to the side corridor when a voice called out from behind me. Familiar. Hesitant. Camille, wait. I turned slowly, already knowing who it was. Brent stood just outside the golden frame of the ballroom door, hands in his pockets like he didn't know what to do with them. He looked different, somehow smaller than I remembered, like all the arrogance had been rinsed from him in the flood of humiliation. I stopped but didn't step toward him. I just want to talk, he said. You've already said plenty, I replied. In court documents, in press interviews, on social media. I know, he said, glancing down at the polished marble. I was wrong. About a lot of things. I didn't say anything. He looked up again, voice catching. Look, I got caught up in it. The money, the company, your mom promising me connections if I just. I don't know. I was stupid. And scared. And I didn't fight for you. I should have. You didn't fight for me, I said quietly. You fought against me. He flinched at that. I don't think I've ever seen him look more like a boy playing dress-up in a suit. But you were always better than all of this. I know you don't owe me anything, but if there's a chance to start over, to fix. There isn't. I said simply. Brent's mouth opened, then closed. His shoulders sank a little. He took a small step back, as if even being near me was too heavy a reminder. I didn't hate him. Not anymore. He wasn't worth that weight. I walked past him without another word, heels clicking against marble that had once echoed with applause for people who now avoided eye contact. Then I saw her. Eleanor. She wasn't standing with the other board members. She wasn't near Veronica. She was just off to the side near a tall vase of calla lilies that now looked like funeral flowers. She watched me approach, her posture stiff but her expression unreadable. When I got closer, she stepped forward, opened her mouth like she was going to say something maternal. Maybe an apology. Maybe a plea. But I didn't give her the chance. Funny, I said, my voice low and calm. A year ago you told me I didn't belong here. Her eyes flickered. Now look around. Not a single person in this room can meet my gaze. Not even you. Her lips parted slightly like my words had knocked the air from her lungs. And I kept walking. I didn't stop for the press. I didn't answer the flood of texts lighting up my phone. I didn't check to see if Veronica had been escorted out yet or if someone had posted the gala debacle online already. I didn't need to. The truth didn't need a microphone anymore. It had a life of its own. Outside, the air was sharp and clean. The sounds of the gala faded behind me, replaced by the quiet hum of street traffic and the occasional footsteps of someone leaving early, shaken and speechless. I didn't cry. I didn't smile either. I just breathed. At the corner, a town car waited, driver already holding the door open. He nodded respectfully, recognizing me from when I arrived hours ago before anything had erupted. Inside the car was warm, the leather familiar. I leaned back, letting my head rest against the seat, fingers tracing the edge of my clutch. Inside, it was the original patent form, signed and time-stamped, the one they had laughed at when I first filed it. Now it had spoken for me louder than any speech could. The driver glanced at me through the rearview mirror. Where to, ma'am? I gave him the name of the boutique hotel Mark and I had chosen, far from the city center. Quiet. Unassuming. With a garden courtyard and a room service menu that included lavender tea. As the car pulled away, I looked out the window, not at the skyline but at the people on the sidewalks. Strangers. Some laughing, some arguing over nothing, some just walking fast toward places I'd never know. None of them knew what had just happened in that ballroom. And I liked that. I liked that the world kept turning uncaring and honest, while that room full of lies collapsed in on itself. My phone buzzed again. I ignored it. Mark would be waiting. He always knew when to speak and when not to. When I arrived, he'd probably have taken off his tie and loosened his sleeves, waiting with a bottle of ginger ale instead of champagne. because he knew I didn't want to celebrate. Not yet. This wasn't a victory parade. This was closure. And as we turned down a quieter street, the lights of the gala fading behind us, I closed my eyes and let the silence stretch. It was the kind of silence that didn't need to be filled. The kind that came after something heavy was finally lifted. The kind I had waited a long time to earn. By the time I got back to my apartment, my inbox had exploded. 6,000 new orders. I stared at the screen, barely blinking. Our site had slowed from the traffic surge. Freeman Naturals was trending on every platform, not because of a viral gimmick or celebrity endorsement, but because the world had watched me stand up to the people who tried to erase me and win. 3 different retail chains had sent partnership proposals. One of them was Whole Roots, a national chain with organic-only policies and a notorious vetting process. The number at the bottom of their proposal made me sit down. $3 million, not investment. Purchase orders. It wasn't just vindication, it was expansion scale, real leverage. And for the first time, I didn't feel like I had to prove I was worth it. That is, until the article dropped. It came from the Market Eye, a high-traffic financial outlet known for think pieces and hot takes. The headline hit like a slap. Camille Whitaker, clean beauty, visionary or mastermind of a corporate takedown. My stomach turned. The body of the article wasn't outright defamatory, but it didn't have to be. It asked questions in just the right tone, threaded implications through select quotes, and ended with a punch, a poll asking readers if they believed I had orchestrated the fall of Luxé using insider knowledge. There it was. The doubt. The shadow. Brent's scandal had gone nuclear after the gala. Luxé's stock had nosedived. Their overseas partners were threatening litigation. Eleanor had stepped down from the board under what they called health concerns, and Brent had deleted all his social media. But I had never spoken publicly about it. Never posted, never liked or shared a thing. Yet somehow I was still being painted as the puppet master. Ethan was already on the phone when I walked into the office. "No, she hasn't commented yet," I heard him say. "And no, she's not giving exclusive interviews." He glanced up at me. His expression told me everything. They wouldn't stop until I said something. I waited for him to finish, then closed the door behind us. "They're coming for the story," I said. "Even if there's nothing to find." "They always do," he replied. "But we control the narrative." "You want to hold a press conference?" I nodded. We held it 2 days later. Not in some fancy ballroom, not at a luxury venue, but in our own warehouse. The production floor was clean and simple. Pallets of unboxed skincare stood behind me like quiet proof. The smell of lemongrass and aloe was faint in the air. The room was packed. Reporters, investors, even skeptics I recognized from the early days. Cameras flashed. Ethan stood to the side, arms folded, stone-faced and ready. I stepped up to the mic. "I'm not going to waste time defending my ethics against clickbait speculation," I began. "But I will tell you exactly what I do stand for." I looked around the room, letting it settle. Transparency, integrity, and a future where you don't have to choose between looking good and doing good. There's a reason people don't trust the beauty industry. Smoke and mirrors sell fast, but they don't last. Freeman Naturals isn't just a skincare line, it's a commitment. We publish our sourcing, we publish our margins, we publish our lab results. Because you deserve to know what touches your skin. You want to know if I took down Luxé, I didn't have to. Their lies did it for them. Reporters shouted questions. I answered the ones worth answering. Did you leak anything to the press number? But I also didn't protect people who built empires on exploitation. Was this revenge number? It was revelation. And about time. Do you plan to compete on the same shelf space as Luxé once they recover? I don't compete with ghosts. That last line made the front page of Green Daily. But it wasn't the headline that stayed with me. It was something Marissa published the following Sunday. Her op-ed was simple, thoughtful, and sharp as glass. A year ago, Camille Whitaker was labeled too poor, too sensitive, too naive for this industry. Today, she runs one of the fastest-growing clean beauty brands in America. She didn't inherit it, she didn't marry into it, she built it, with facts not favors. And while others lit matches, she grew gardens. I teared up reading that. There was something surreal about seeing your struggle written back to you through someone else's words. As if the pain had been translated into something legible, something lasting. I printed it out and pinned it to the corkboard in our main office. Next to it, I taped the first purchase order from Whole Roots. Below that, a sticky note with 2 words scribbled in blue ink. Keep going. And I would. The press conference had turned the tide, but the whispers weren't gone. They never really go away. Success doesn't silence doubt, it just gives you the microphone to speak louder than it. What mattered now was what we built next. Because they could question my methods all they wanted. But they couldn't buy my name. They couldn't buy my values. They couldn't buy me. The receptionist knocked gently on the glass door to my office and whispered that someone was asking to speak with me. She hesitated before adding, "It's Eleanor Langford." I looked up from the sample shelf. I was organizing, my fingers brushing against the labels we had just redesigned. I hadn't heard that name spoken aloud in months, but the sound of it still sat heavy in the room. I stood in silence for a moment, then nodded. "Show her in." She walked in slowly, wearing a pale gray coat and matching scarf despite the spring weather. Her hair was swept up in a tight bun, and her heels clicked softly against the reclaimed wood floor of the Freeman Naturals lobby. Her eyes scanned the space with a kind of quiet wonder. The plants, the shelves of product, the wall of Polaroids showing women who had used our scholarship fund to start over. She stopped in front of one that featured a single mother from Ohio and stared a second longer than necessary. She didn't speak until she sat across from me in the small meeting area by the window. "This is a beautiful place, Camille. Warm, real." I nodded once. "Thank you." For a moment there was only the sound of the wind brushing against the glass. Eleanor reached into her handbag and took out a folded piece of paper. She held it delicately, almost like it might disintegrate. "I'm not here to ask anything of you. But I'd like to tell you something." She placed the paper down between us. "A few weeks ago, my granddaughter Chloe came home from school and asked me why I didn't like you. She had seen a news clip, the one where you spoke at the conference. She said you looked like a hero." My chest tightened. She asked if I hated poor people. I looked at Eleanor carefully. Her voice hadn't cracked, but her shoulders were tight and her fingers twitched as they rested on her lap. I didn't know what to tell her, Camille. There it was. The kind of sentence that breaks something unspoken. I didn't answer. She took a breath, slow and heavy. I didn't say yes, but I didn't say no either. And that silence. It rang louder than anything I could have said. I stayed still. "You know, when Chloe was born, I promised myself I'd be the kind of grandmother who'd teach her better. But last night she looked at me like I was someone she didn't recognize, and I think she was right." She turned her eyes to the window, blinking fast. "I hurt you. I judged you before I ever spoke to you. I listened to gossip, assumptions, and entitlement. And in the end, none of that protected me from seeing you build something that matters. Something that heals." She gestured around the office, eyes now glassy. "I used to think legacy was about money, buildings with our names on them. But this is something else." I leaned back in my seat, fingers loosely clasped. "I don't hate you, Eleanor. But I haven't forgotten either." She nodded. "I wouldn't expect you to." We sat in silence. She looked down at the paper again. "I came today to offer something. Not as redemption. I know I don't get to ask for that. But maybe as a start." She slid the paper across the table. It was a proposal. Eleanor Langford wished to fund a scholarship through Freeman Naturals, a 10-year commitment. Full tuition and living expenses for women pursuing degrees in environmental science or sustainable business. Preference given to single mothers and those from underrepresented backgrounds. I read every line. "You don't have to attach my name. I know the headlines would be cynical. But if you do this, maybe someone like you won't have to knock on a dozen doors just to be told they don't belong." I looked up. "And if we only help one woman," she nodded, eyes holding mine. "Then my mistake wasn't completely in vain." I exhaled. "I'll have our legal team review it." She smiled, almost relieved. "That's more than I hoped for." Before she stood up, she looked at the Polaroids again. She pointed to one near the middle. "That one." I want to fund her housing next year, quietly. I watched her walk back through the office. This time her heels didn't sound so sharp. Later that evening I sat on the rooftop garden we had just finished renovating. The air smelled of lemon balm and lavender. From below the hum of production teams and packaging machines buzzed like a soft heartbeat. The same building I once begged to rent a corner of was now our own. I pulled up Chloe's drawing that Marissa had sent me weeks ago. It showed a woman standing in front of a big green plant, arms open. Above it, in a child's uneven handwriting, it read, "Good people grow things." I let the wind move through the page. And for the first time I didn't just believe it. I knew I was one of them. They called it a strategic expansion meeting, but I knew exactly what it was the moment I stepped into the Freeman Naturals boardroom in Seattle. Polished wood, filtered sunlight, filtered smiles. Richard Prescott stood at the head of the table, flanked by his legal team and brand executives, all pretending this wasn't a full-circle moment. He waited until everyone was seated before he spoke. His voice for once lacked the usual self-assured edge. "Camille, thank you for coming. I realize this invitation may feel overdue." I didn't smile. I didn't offer anything except eye contact. He didn't deserve more yet. Richard cleared his throat. "We've reviewed our global licensing structure. Freeman Naturals is ready to enter the European market. Your leadership in wellness branding has made waves. Sweden's Kalavara Group specifically asked for you as their preferred collaborator." I nodded once. And he looked around, then back at me. "We'd like to formally invite you to lead that expansion. As a partner. With full creative control, board representation, and revenue share." There was a beat of silence that no one dared to fill. I leaned back, watching him. It would have been so easy to feel smug. But instead, I just felt grounded. Like every moment of doubt had finally found its balance. Across the table, Maya caught my eye. Her small smile was barely visible, but it held a universe. David Sutherland spoke next. "Legal has received formal documentation from Luxe Corporation. They've issued an apology and withdrawn the infringing product line. Their CEO personally acknowledged the origin of the plant-based extraction method was yours." I glanced at the binder on the table. The glossy finish couldn't hide the history. Richard adjusted his watch. "I'm not here to excuse the past. We misjudged you. And that mistake almost cost us our future. If you're willing, we'd like to rebuild that future together." I opened the binder. The terms were fair, better than fair. But that wasn't what mattered. I flipped to the last page where the signature line waited. Then I pulled out my pen and wrote my name in smooth, deliberate strokes. When I looked up, the room exhaled. After the meeting, Maya and I stepped outside into the Seattle air, crisp and laced with the scent of pine and coffee. We stood on the balcony that overlooked the harbor, the distant ferries slicing through the gray-blue water like quiet promises. "Do you remember," Maya said, "when we used to test formulas on your stovetop?" She laughed, wiping at the corner of her eye. "We didn't even have proper measuring tools. You used your grandma's mason jars." I smiled softly. "We had 3 burners, 1 blender, and a dream that barely fit on your kitchen counter. And now," she whispered, "you're licensing globally. From that little apartment to Scandinavia." I looked out at the skyline. They had tried to take so much. My voice, my work, my place in the world. But they had failed. Not because I fought harder, but because the truth, when protected with enough care and patience, becomes undeniable. We walked back inside to finalize the logistics. Flights to Stockholm. Site visits. Co-branded product lines with sustainability guidelines I wrote myself. This wasn't about revenge. It wasn't even about reclaiming something. It was about building what no one thought I could, then watching them choose it over everything else. Before we left the building, Richard approached me again, this time without the entourage. "One more thing, Camille. I hope one day you can forgive the way we treated you. You were always more than what we saw." I considered him for a long moment. Forgiveness to me was not absolution. It was simply letting go of the need for anything more from someone who had already revealed who they were. "You don't need my forgiveness," I said. "You need to remember this moment the next time you underestimate someone." He nodded, quietly humbled. Then stepped aside as I walked past. In the elevator, Maya exhaled. You could have said no. You had every reason to. Why did you say yes? Because sometimes I said the best way to respond to being erased is to sign your name bigger. The doors opened and we walked out together. The skyline had shifted slightly in the golden afternoon light, but it was the same city. Only now I wasn't just passing through it, I was shaping it. And they knew it. I arrived at the new Freeman Naturals global headquarters 30 minutes before the grand opening wearing a sleek navy blue suit that I had custom-tailored for this moment. The early morning sun was casting golden light over the glass-paneled facade, reflecting back a woman I could hardly recognize, the version of me that no longer asked for a seat at anyone's table. The plaza in front of the building buzzed with final touches. Event staff moved quickly, arranging bouquets of wildflowers, testing the sound system, placing silver pitchers of lemon water on cocktail tables lined with name tags. Reporters had already begun gathering near the velvet rope, their camera crews adjusting angles to catch the best view of the branded backdrop. Inside, the lobby shimmered in natural light, high ceilings stretching above oak-paneled walls engraved with the brand's mission. It was clean, sustainable, proudly built from the ground up. And every inch of it had my signature behind it. Upstairs, I found Nina waiting near the reception area holding a tablet and grinning. "Press is confirmed," she said. "Maya's walking the investors through the product lab now. Graham's outside with city officials." "You ready?" I gave her a nod, then looked around the space. This wasn't just a building. It was proof that being cast out didn't mean staying out. You could be rejected from a family, a marriage, an empire, and still carve a new world with your bare hands. By 10 o'clock, the courtyard was filled. Faces from my past and present mingled, early employees who'd taken a chance on me, new partners from clean tech, a few college professors who'd once told me I was too ambitious for the roles I applied to. They all stood shoulder to shoulder watching as I stepped onto the stage built beneath the new company emblem. The mic felt cool in my palm. My voice, when it came, was steady. "Thank you for being here," I began. "A year ago, I stood in front of a house I helped build, surrounded by people who told me I didn't belong. Not because I lacked skills, not because I hadn't contributed, but because I came from a background they thought wasn't good enough." A ripple of murmurs moved through the crowd. I let it settle. They said I was too poor, too different. That I didn't deserve a place at their table. So I built my own. And today I welcome you all to it. Nina and Maya clapped first. Then the applause swelled, echoing between the marble walls of the plaza. I looked down and spotted familiar faces. Our first intern, who now led R&D, a single mom who told me last year that joining Freeman Naturals helped her afford her first home, a retired chemist who'd left Big Pharma to build something ethical. Then my eyes caught something unexpected. Brent. He stood near the edge of the crowd wearing a crisp gray suit. His expression was unreadable, somewhere between pride and regret. He didn't approach, didn't wave, just watched. And when the speech ended, he turned and left. Later that afternoon, I checked my phone and saw his name in my messages. "Congratulations. You did it. I always believed you would." I stared at the screen for a full minute. Then I pressed delete. In the lounge on the top floor, I joined Graham and Nina for a toast. Maya came in laughing, waving a copy of the front page of the local business journal, my face beside the headline, "From Cast Aside to CEO Camille Whitaker's Comeback Leaves Silicon Valley in Awe." We raised our glasses. "To rebuilding," Graham said. "To not needing anyone's permission," added Nina. I smiled and tapped my glass against theirs. "To walking away and winning anyway." As the sun dipped lower, I stepped out onto the rooftop terrace alone. From there, the city stretched beneath me, its sounds muffled, its pace slowed just for a moment. I leaned on the railing, watching as traffic crawled along the avenues like veins in a living body, people bustling through lives that were entirely their own. There was a time I would have given anything to be accepted by Brent's family. I tried to fit into their world. I tried to apologize for not being born into wealth, for being someone who had to work for every step. But now, standing above the skyline of the city I helped reshape, I understood something even deeper. I didn't need to enter their world to prove my worth. I had created something else, something more inclusive, more honest. A company that didn't judge applicants by pedigree or zip code. a culture that valued effort over image. I had built a place where no one would be told they didn't belong. And in doing so, I had finally come home to myself. Behind me, the lights of the building began to flicker on, illuminating the words etched in silver above the door. Everyone deserves a place to begin. I whispered it out loud to the wind, and the breeze seemed to carry it forward into the twilight. If you've ever been told you weren't good enough, too poor, too loud, too quiet, too complicated, let this be your reminder. You don't need to fit into their story to write your own. Now I'd love to hear from you. Have you ever been dismissed or judged because of your background? How did you rise above it, or how do you plan to drop your thoughts in the comments? And if this story spoke to you, share it, like it, subscribe. Let's make space for more voices like yours. You belong here.